Donc, j'ai dit, nous sommes 4.
As I say, there are 4 of us who are going to take the floor from different specializations, but we have something which binds us together. We, all 4 of us, have carried out a research project with a very important agent with regard to the independence of women. Today, we are talking about education, training, and economic participation of women. And you can see that this link-up is not done just by chance. It's not a chance thing, because in the last decades, the development programs, they within the Millennium Goals or within the framework of action plans for parity among the genders of the World Bank or other projects, they all have given a great deal of importance to education as an effective strategy to be able to develop the empowerment of women. Now, with regard, and therefore, in the countries that we're concerned with, the MENA, MENA countries, and sub-Saharan African countries, in these 2 areas, if I take, for example, the MENA countries, remarkable things have been achieved in terms of education, and this has led to a substantive reduction of the gender divide in terms of literacy and also education from 1985 to 2010, which, however, has not been the case in sub-Saharan Africa, where things still have to be done to achieve equality. And you can see on this graph here, where we see the scores of the countries in terms of education. Sub-Saharan Africa is in last place. However, unlike or going against the percentage of economic participation of women and women in the workforce, in other words, in sub-Saharan Africa, if we look at the participation of women in the workforce, in the MENA countries, where we have a larger access to education, nonetheless, the workforce, in fact, includes very, very few women who are in last place. And in fact, this despite the fact that education is a strategy to reinforce the economic participation of women. And here we see that in this region, be it sub-Saharan Africa or the MENA countries, there is no link really between the workforce and education, because in fact we have participation rates which are very low, and but nonetheless, where we have a very low education rate, we have a greater number of people or women in the workforce. So the 2 things don't jibe. So we have a problem there. In the MENA countries, where we see an increase in the education levels, this has not led to an increase in women's chances in the economic sector. And Dr. Chalabi, who is director of Women and Human Rights and the Middle East Program, the Human Rights Program in the Middle East, I beg your pardon, says the speaker, he calls this the participation paradox of women in the MENA countries. So we see that there are other indicators that have to be used, and these indicators are just as important as access to education. And it's for that reason, and here I'd like to show you the participation rates of women in the workforce. Now you see where it's red, it's less than 25%, from 0 to 25%, and then after that you can see it gradually goes up until you get to the dark blue. And here you can see in the MENA countries, it's all red, or a little less red, with a few differences between the countries. Whereas blue we see in sub-Saharan Africa, where, as I say, women, in fact, are not on an equal basis when it comes to education. So this is a situation, even if there are some differences in terms of the geography, things are a bit better in Northern Africa. Things have gone up a bit. So we have to use other indicators. And for that reason, the Global Gender Gap Index was created in 2006 and measures the gap between men and women. And they use 4 fundamental categories. 4 indicators are used by this index. There's education, there's health, participation, economic participation, and also the presence in the public sphere, the decision-making process, in other words, in the political sphere. So this is the way that this Global Gender Gap Index is presented. And the scores goes from 0 to 1. When you get 1, there is equality. When you get to close to 0, you have a situation of lack of equality. And we look at the overall score of these countries we're talking about in the various countries of the world as well, especially the 2 regions that we're talking about, we're interested in. And yet again, we see the MENA countries that come in last. Whereas sub-Saharan Africa is much better in terms of the score. Why? Because in the MENA countries, women are not present in the political sphere, nor, let's say, they are not fully present, and they do not fully participate in the economy of their countries. So these are the types of indicators that are very closely linked. And it's very important to have participated in the economic and political sphere. That's essential for economic participation. But economic participation, when you participate in the economy, it's very important indicator for presence also in the political era and sphere, and vice versa. I would like to say one thing, because I presented these graphs and statistics. Usually these statistics are supplied by the countries themselves, and sometimes that causes a problem in some countries with regard to the reliability of these data. And the last report of the European Economic Forum in 2014, the last one published, you find Syria with complete data, and therefore one had to ask, how could it furnish these data given the state in which it, in fact, is in today? And how can it have a position which is close to Jordan or Tunisia? Therefore, there are question marks that can be put on that, and we have to fully understand this. And to be able to look into this, I'd like to ask my colleague, Riadh, again, looking at the statistics and the percentage of participation, the economic participation in sub-Saharan Africa, these rates of participation are much higher than those that we see for the MENA region, unlike the education. And in some studies, it is said that African women, in fact, are participate in a subsistence type of economy, which is based on agriculture, of course, and this is not linked, of course, to education. And here I go back to the statistics. Is it that in certain countries one takes into account informal work, irregular, unregistered work of women, but in other countries, in fact, informal work is not taken into account? And I'd like to ask Riadh to answer this question, please.
Merci. En fait, je pense que les...
Well, yes, I think that the statistics, apart from the fact that when we talk about national statistics, these are given by legally recognized institutions, and they're not independent of state policy. In fact, you see the image that was given of Tunisia before the revolution. Everything, in fact, seemed to be the best in an ideal world. There's another thing, is that statistics usually are founded on a certain number of paradigms. For example, if you take the question of economic women's empowerment, there are two ways of calculating this. There's one way, which is calculating the real economic contribution of women, and there you include all the activities, be in formal or informal grey economy, and perhaps that explains the very high participation rates of women in certain countries where, in fact, the real contribution of women is taken into account. But in other areas, you don't look at participation, but you look to certain criteria that are easy to measure, i.e., participation of women in the active working population, or you look at women entrepreneurs. And here, again, things aren't very clear either. For example, if I take the case of Tunisia up to now, we didn't really have any exact figures with regard to the number of women entrepreneurs. If you asked the trade unions, that give you one figure, which went up to 18,000 people, but if you approached other state institutions, they would say that it's not more than 10,000. So it depends on the basic criterion that you use to calculate women's economic contribution to a country. But I defend the thesis in terms of statistics that women, in fact, are the victims of economic violence. And they're victims because, in fact, they are not included when they really, in fact, contribute largely to the economy, because their contribution, in fact, is underestimated, is not very often taken into account, and nor is their know-how, which is very important, that has been accumulated over generations, taken into account. We're talking about sharing knowledge and know-how in this meeting, but all the traditional knowledge and know-how which has been accumulated by experience on the part of women, unfortunately, is not given the place it well deserves, because all the development policies are based on the views of experts. That's the situation we find ourselves in. And the gentleman who talked about the need to work in the field, to understand the practices and the real needs and the real potential of people in the field, well, I think he's very right. And I think that it's this paradigm that has to be put forward if we are to accelerate a process of development. Because otherwise we have seen so many failures when development was conceived, especially by experts. The other risk of the statistic exclusion of women's contribution to the economy is, for example, when you have a task or craft which is not recognized, you don't have many people who are going to think in terms of training programs in a unrecognized craft, or try and have technological transfer so that you can tap into this, perhaps make this a more viable task, which is less dangerous, which creates a lot more value added. For example, if you take the professional vocational training centers, there are very few professional training centers which are set up in developing countries based on women's activities. Jordan is an exception where there is a university to, in fact, train nurses, but that's not very often the case. Another thing, and perhaps I could try and explain why in the MENA countries we have invested enormously in education, and in most of these countries there are more women at the university than men in university. Why? Because in terms of the economic integration of women, and why doesn't this work, even if they're so educated? It doesn't work because there's a cultural issue, there's a question of values there, which means that women do not have freedom of movement. They're expected to remain within the family. They're not allowed to leave their native town, country, or village. There is an attempt to control them, and therefore the opportunities that they have are certainly very few and far between. And therefore, empowerment of women is the opening up of the field of the possible. And if you confine a person to a very limited sphere, well, their possibilities are very, very restricted. So that's the first answer to your question. My second question, I'm going to address to Arwa from Jordan. In Tunisia, and we have talked about education of the access of women in the MENA countries, and we have achieved rates in which in our universities, and I presume in yours as well, there are more women than men. But if you take formal works, the access to the job market in Tunisia, for example, in fact, people with university degrees, in fact, they are the most unemployed in Tunisia. Is it the same situation in Jordan? And generally, have you got any ideas with regard to, the MENA countries and what's happening in yours?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think when we talk about economical participation of women and our part of the world in the MENA countries, specifically in the Middle East and North Africa, I agree that we are faced with the paradox that you talked about. We have more educated women and less participation in the workforce. And just to give you an overview about the situation in Jordan, which is, in my view, is a little bit even worse than, in sub-Saharan Africa or in Tunisia, because the percentage of women who participate in the workforce is very low in comparison with the level of education and the number of women who comes and get higher education. So let me just give you a little bit of overview about what's happening in my country. We have exhibited equity between men and women, and sometimes women exceeds the level of education of the man in our country. So we have filled the gap, the illiteracy gap between men and women, and now in Jordan, 97% gender parity illiteracy is among the top of the 5 MENA countries. Jordanian women, they achieved higher grades than males in almost every level of education, and we have more women in the university than we have men. Yet these gains, what is happening with the what's happening, women, they go to the university, they get higher degrees, but they can't find jobs. While men, with lower level of education, they find jobs. So women, they have to compete for the job with the men. And usually, if they will be employed, they have to have higher level of education than the counterpart of men. This is one thing. The other thing is that, we see the higher educated women with higher education, they have more opportunity to compete in the workforce. Although they can't find the job, but they have to. These are the women who compete for the jobs in order to find it. The other issue when we talk about employment and women participation in Jordan, we look at the overall employment rate in the country. I think Jordan is one of the largest countries with unemployment among both men and women. And taking that into considerations, we will find out that more women are unemployed than men. And the unemployment is longer than the time that the man needs. So if we will look at the unemployment in Jordan, it's extremely low. It's at 15%, and it is the lowest in the region. And the women's unemployment is 46% of the unemployment, compared to 23% for the men. In 2010, the World Economic Forum reported that gender gap ranked Jordan the 120th among 134 countries in terms of women's economic opportunities, well below many of the other middle-income countries. In 2010, the female labor force participation rate in Jordan was about the fourth that of the males, 22 versus 87%. In 2011, women represented less than 20% of the total workforce in Jordan. At the same time, when in labor force, women face very high unemployment level, particularly for young and educated group. And women with higher education have much greater probability of joining the labor force. And women with post-secondary education and university and postgraduate education are represented respectively about 32 and 75% likelier to be in the labor workforce than their less educated counterparts. In Jordan, on average, women tend to be more qualified than men in similar jobs. So women are more likely to find a job or be hired only if they have higher education than men. And there is evidence from past work that this is true even for a similar job. This could indicate job discrimination effects leading to a lower expected remuneration for women, which will also discourage women from entering the labor workforce altogether. So women are discouraged by the situation, the high unemployment rate, and the competition with the men in the workforce. At the same time, like what Riadh said, that sometimes because of the social cultural influences, women, they tend to not take jobs away from their homes, so they are restricted in very limited areas, and they would not take jobs. If I'm from the north, like from Irbid, I would prefer to stay in Irbid and find a job there. And most women in Jordan, they take like very narrow types of jobs, like the education or in medical sectors. So this will narrow the opportunities that is allowed and offered to women. At the same time, the education that they receive, just to qualify them into these two or very limited types of jobs, therefore the competition will become very very high with other jobs. So most women, even they are well qualified and obtain the higher education, they get into like humanities and education that qualifies them to become teachers or nurses or some like that. So the the social, cultural background forces sometimes the women to go into these limited, types of jobs, and so the competition will be very high. The other thing is that women in Jordan, they like to go to public sector, the public sector. And because of their qualifications and because of the security of the jobs that the public sector provides. When we talk about the private sector, the skill mix, the qualifications, the education tends to be different from those the woman has. Therefore, men usually they go to the public sectors. Another important issue when we talk about employment and economical participation of women in Jordan is the women, they are, shorter life in the job market. Like once they get married, sometimes they leave the job because they want to take care of their families, and sometimes the husbands doesn't approve of their work and working outside the home. So this, put a lot of pressure and challenges in front of the well-educated women, and those who really continue and persevere in the workforce. I think they have, different educational levels. Maybe they come from the big cities and in the centers, but when it comes to the women in the less privileged areas, I think they face a lot of challenges, and sometimes they give up on looking and competing in the workforce. Thank you very much.
Je m'adresse encore une fois à Riadh. Je m'adresse de nouveau.
Microphone, please. Microphone. Oh, it's not on.
Marche pas?
Now it works. Okay.
Donc, de nouveau, je m'adresse
So
à
once
Riadh
again,
pour lui
I
poser
asked
une question.
Riadh to
Arwa
ask
vient
a
de parler de
question. We just talked
discrimination.
about
Et tu as tout à
discrimination,
l'heure parlé
and
de
you have
violence.
talked
Est-ce que vraiment
about
l'exclusion
violence. Is
économique des
economic
femmes
exclusion
est une
of women a
forme de
form of
violence?
violence?
À l'égard des femmes, bien entendu.
Of course, violence
Oui,
perpetrated on women. Yes, it is. Because to the extent that women don't have the possibility of using their talent and skills, and to the extent that women don't have the same possibility to benefit from the opportunities that men have, well, that's a violence, and worse still, it's a sort of violence that is also sanctioned by law. The legal framework discriminates in many countries, especially in the MENA countries. And here I go back to a study and a report carried out by the World Bank in 2013 called Women, Business and Law, and it was a report done in 143 economies. And out of the 143 countries, there are 128 economies at least that have provisions discriminating against women. And in fact, there are 21 legal distributions and 26, that's for non-married women, 26 against married women. Of these countries that have these discriminatory factors, 14, in fact, are found in the MENA countries. In sub-Saharan countries, Africa is much more liberal here vis-à-vis women. There are 2 in Eastern Asia and the Pacific, and just in South Pacific there's just 1. And in fact, certain women are excluded legally from exercising certain professions. Canada, Armenia, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Hungary, and so on have no provisions that make any difference between men and women. And what's also interesting is to see the sort of discrimination which is legally instituted against women. Looking for a passport, asking for a passport, for example. Having the right to own property.
ou sortir de chez
traveling
soi,
or
pas
leaving
seulement
one's home,
voyager à
not
l'étranger.
just traveling abroad.
Voyager à l'étranger, bien
Going
sûr.
abroad, of course, is a discriminatory factor
Obtenir
against women.
un emploi
Getting a job
sans permission.
without permission.
Permission du père,
Permission of the
du mari,
father,
du frère,
of the
etc.
brother, husband, or whatever.
Signer un contrat,
Signing a
c'est le
contract.
plus grave. Là.
And I think that's the most severe
Enregistrer
restriction.
une entreprise.
Setting up
Être
a
chef
company,
de
being
ménage ou chef de famille.
the head
Dans
of the
certains pays, c'est
family.
complètement interdit.
In some countries, it's absolutely forbidden.
Donner sa nationalité à ses enfants.
Giving one's nationality to one's children.
Ouvrir un compte bancaire.
Opening a bank
Dans
account.
certains pays, c'est
In
même
certain
pas possible
countries,
pour
it's
les
not
femmes.
possible for women to have a bank
Choisir
account.
où habiter.
Choose where
Obtenir
they live.
une carte d'identité.
Obtaining an ID card.
Avoir
Having
le droit de propriété,
right
les droits
to
à l'héritage, travailler la
the
nuit,
subject of succession
faire
and
les mêmes
inheritance,
métiers que les
working
hommes,
at night, doing the same
profiter
job as
d'un
women,
statut
being
de
able
retraité,
to
etc.,
have
La
a
liste est
pension
longue,
and
je
so
vais
on.
pas
I mean,
continuer.
and so on and so forth. The list is very
La
long.
violence économique,
And,
elle se situe
well, economic
avant
violence,
le
well,
recrutement,
this in fact
avant
takes
la
place
possibilité
before
d'être
recruiting,
employé,
before
quand il s'agit
the
d'emploi,
possibility of even
jusqu'à la
being
fin du
employed, right up
processus
through
de la
to
vie
the
active.
end of the
Et là,
process, of the
l'une
end
des
of one's
violences
working
les plus
life.
connues dans
And
le
one
monde
of the
entier, c'est le
most
plafond de verre.
one of the greatest violence is the so-called glass ceiling. Women get into a job, are successful, can evolve and develop. They come up against invisible constraints. That's why it's called a glass ceiling, which in fact stops them from getting to the top. And this obviously is due to many things, because the statute of women in work is not seen in terms of the men's availability or sort of statute, but also there are other things as well. There's the question of career management, and of course women are in fact tugged between their family responsibilities and their job responsibilities. In fact, they don't have a third day, if you like, to develop their networks, to go and do lobbying, and thereby to succeed and climb the career ladder. We have to recognize that if women don't have the same chance of being able to be part of the workforce, and if they don't participate in the economy, it costs a great deal to the society as a whole. And that cost has been, in fact, measured by a think tank which is called Jews and Company, which was a study published in 2012 that showed that in a country like Egypt, for example, in 2020, had women had the same opportunity to enter the workforce as men, well, the GDP would increase by 35%. And they, in fact, listed 120 odd countries in which they indicated and calculated the index for the third millennium, for the third billion, because in fact they have calculated in the next decade there's going to be 1 billion women who could get into the workforce. And therefore they developed an index to consider what the relationship is with regard to women's skills and ability to be part of the workforce, and by that is meant education and also support for entrepreneurship, and what their input would be and what the results would be in terms of women's entrepreneurship and also in terms of the economic process of the country, and also in terms of use of resources. So the countries have been classified. Saudi Arabia obviously is at the bottom of the ladder, also with regard to inputs and output. Tunisia is in a very good position in terms of outputs. It's a bit in the middle of the ladder, but it's much lower when it comes to outputs. In other words, there is support for entrepreneurship also of women, but in terms of active population and the development of real entrepreneurship of women, there we're lagging behind. The countries that are most advanced are particularly, and I'll have a look at the document, the US, and then the UK. If there is gender equality economy, the increase of GDP would in fact only be 5%. So that means that they're already very advanced already in terms of women getting into the workforce. For Japan, it's 9%, and for India, it would be 27%, and 34% would be Egypt. So, in fact, the countries lose and miss out a great deal if they don't allow half of their population to get into the workforce. Yes, there's a cost there. Now, I'd like to ask Arwa again rapidly, because you have led a project at the university with regard to this violence. Do you agree? Very rapidly, please. Do you agree that the economic exclusion of women is also a violence against, perpetrating violence against women?
Yes, I do agree. This is a very rapid response to your question. I think, when it comes to women, and I can see that, there is discrimination and gender-based violence against women, not only in the MENA region and in the Middle East. I think this is a universal, gender-based violence and economical violence, all sorts of violence against women is universal. Some countries, they have more, violence, and others they are, So the continuum, starts with, between, the issue or the problem to be big and or medium until sometimes it could be minimal. But back to my project, I worked in a project with 12 Jordanian women. They were part of master's program. I taught them and enrolled them in my action research. And in that research, we started using information communication technology to help women start reflecting on their own socio-cultural, economical situation, and using the information communication, and to be able to start, gaining more awareness about, themselves as a human being rather than, only women and taking care of a husband and children, and to have goals in their lives. At the beginning, I want to just reflect on the transformation that these women went through from the start till the end, and it was over 1 year the research took place, and you could find the change in the transformation in these women. Like, for example, one of the participants, she told me that she was married, she was working, she was a nurse and getting her master's, but she told me that she never went downtown to a store to buy things to her house. And this reflects the, economical control that her husband, has over her. And then she confronted that, and she told me about it, that she does not have the freedom to use the money or her salary in the way she likes. So anything she wants to buy or to get, her husband, he needs to get it to her. But with the participation in the project and with the reflection and the exchange of these ideas and the idea of getting that power back, you know, to herself, you can't believe the transformation at the end. You know, she was able to negotiate with her husband that, you know, her salary is hers and she has the freedom to, and she has the right to spend it the way she wants. And she, toward the end, she would come and bring things with her that I went downtown, I bought it, and, you know, at that level. So if we want to talk about violence and economical participation, some women, they do participate, but they are under economical violence. They are controlled by their husbands or fathers or brothers, and they don't have the freedom to, you know, spend their salary or their money or their income with freedom and where they would like to do it. I want to add, I agree completely with everything that Riadh said, but there is another issue when we talk about education and empowerment of women. In the context of the socio-cultural aspects in the MENA region, the discrimination between men and women, boys and girls. And when we talk about, you know, countries under economical pressure, the priority for education goes to the boys because they are more responsible for taking care of their families. Even when you ask women, they would think that if there is a job open, the priority for the job is for the man because he will be taking care of the family and will have a home, and he's the breadwinner to that home. I think this is a very important dimension when we talk about discrimination and exclusion of women and you know, reflect on it as it is violence against women. This is what I wanted to add. In terms of all the socio-cultural aspects, is the discrimination between men and women. Now it is becoming a little bit less because the economical situation in all over the world, and especially in our part of the region, which goes under political, economical, and the wars that we're witnessing, it is pressuring and pushing people to, you know, push the women outside and to gain revenues. Although they are gaining and they are working and contributing to the economy, however, there are still some restrictions on their movement, the type of job that they need to get, and how they will be spending their money. And I think this is very important to look at it from that perspective. Thank you.
Je vais maintenant poser la question.
Now I'm going to ask the question of Kiss, who has several hats. You're an activist, a civil society activist, and you're very active in the development of the social forum of Zambia. And certain good practices with regard to participation in women in governance can strengthen their economic participation in the workshop, in your workforce. You have started a project in your country, and you have conducted it. Now, can you please rapidly tell us what this project is about? It's rather like a case study, a pilot study. I mean, for us in other countries, we could take it as an example.
Thank you very much for your question. Zambia is one of the countries that you would consider the most poor on the planet. But if you look at the resources the country has, you begin to see that it's actually very rich in terms of the potential that it has. Zambia has the second largest mine for copper. I think on the continent now, it's only been surpassed by the Congo. And it was recently classified as a middle-income country. But the Human Development Index shows extreme poverty at over 60%. A lot of our research into women's empowerment showed that there was glaring inequality and extreme poverty among women, which was higher than that among their male counterparts. And further investigation shows that there are several things within the Zambian context that are the reason for this inequality. I'll just speak of three of them. Religion. Zambia is considered a Christian nation, and there is extreme Christian fundamentalist culture in the country. And most of the times, women are considered second-class citizens, and the Bible is used as a reason for this. Secondly is the culture. Zambia is predominantly a male-dominated, patriarchal, cultural context, where men are more dominant than women. I think all of these examples that we hear are also present in the Zambian context, and a reason for subordination of women in many parts of Zambian society. But to even make this worse, the Zambian constitution is also very unfair to women. It allows the dual legal framework, which allows for culture to supersede the statute sometimes. So we see women not being able to own land, not being able to inherit property, because the law allows for this. Now, after all this research and all of this contextual data, it became very clear that the world in which we live is very unfair, very unequal. Perhaps if we had an alternate universe where everything is perfect, or where women can define their own rules, we would have a better life.
Explain for that.
Yeah, so this is the project that we did. What we did is that we attempted to create this alternate space for dialogue between men and women using internet social media. Essentially, what we did is we created 150 Facebook pages, each and every single one of these Facebook pages representing a parliamentary constituency. We reasoned that for a very rich country like this one, the reason why there's poverty is because there's no distribution of wealth. So working with a fragmented kind of approach where every parliamentary constituency has its own resources, public resources, and they're responsible for distributing this within every constituency. We can go further and propose that failure to distribute this wealth is the reason why there's high poverty in those particular constituencies. So why not work in this decentralized way to try and get local leaders to respond to local communities and then distribute wealth accordingly. Some of the results that we've had have shown that this is actually true. The fact that there is a disconnect between local communities and the people who they elect to represent them and to administer public resources. We've also found that in local communities, when there is a meeting to discuss how public resources will be distributed, women are absent. So in order to make women a little bit more present within these dialogues, what we did is we specifically pick women within the communities, train them on how to use internet social media tools, and then get them to represent their local communities. With basic mobile phones, they take photographs of their local context and share this on social media, and the whole world can see what's happening in their community. Turns out the political establishment gets embarrassed very easily by photographs of, say, garbage not being collected, or lack of access to water, lack of education facilities, and lack of health care. And they respond immediately to these requests. So some of the lessons from this approach are that public resource distribution, the lack of effective public resource distribution has resulted in the disenfranchisement of women and the escalation of poverty in some of the most poor parts of Zambia specifically. But we can extrapolate and say that perhaps lack of resource allocation to women's education across the world may cause women to have extreme illiteracy. Further, we see that when women are given the means to participate in public dialogues, then their perspective also becomes clearer. And so public administrators can make more informed decisions on how to allocate public resources and essentially reduce the level of poverty. We also see that a lot of the reasons why women are disenfranchised in communities in Zambia is because they are seen as a threat by their male counterparts. So that dialogue between men and women never takes place. So there's this kind of resistance by the male establishment to listen to what women have to say. But when you look at the use of social media, the traditional cultural rules do not exist. They don't apply. In fact, the whole identity structures that are very apparent in public space essentially diminish. So the value of what somebody is saying supersedes their identity and where they come from. So class, gender, etc., are secondary to the value of the content. And that dialogue which becomes possible creates a level of social capital that can then shift public behavior and get women more able to participate more effectively and be more capable of participating in the life of their own communities and reduce poverty. So this is the project that we're doing.
Thank you.
Riadh, also, you have carried out a project in the light of the study on the economic empowerment of women. And in the light of your project, are the losses that a country suffers by excluding women from the workforce? Well, first of all, it means losing the chance for sustainable development. Why? Because when women have an income, all studies have shown that they reinvest this income in the education, health, and improvement of the life conditions of their children. So, in fact, there's a cascade effect on the next generation. If women can't have resources by exerting their knowledge and talents, it's the society as a whole that suffers. And that is something which has been proved. Another thing I'd like to insist on, and I carried out a study which in fact was published in 2014 on the economic empowerment of women and the employment and in entrepreneurship. And what was found by this study is that if women can be recruited, they are more likely to, in fact, then set up on their own in a business. In other words, professional experience is a driver of entrepreneurship, women's entrepreneurship, but also employment of men. I'm going to go very quickly because we don't have much time, but I criticized before the fact that all the development projects are usually drafted in expert studios by experts, and usually when you're in a think tank or your group of experts, you have a one-fits-all sort of mentality. And studies, however, have shown, and we have in fact looked at entrepreneurial women, and we have seen that there are many different categories. And if you want to develop entrepreneurship as a process, you have to develop solutions depending on the sort of entrepreneur. If, for example, I take the grey economy, there are women who are stimulated by their experience and training. And for these women, you have to have different sort of policies. There are women that who are leaders, who are born leaders, and they can benefit from the right to funding. And then there are also women who want to create and have created, but in fact they find lack of financing, and therefore they cannot go forward. So you have to treat problems in a much more subtle way, because there's not a one solution fits all if you really want to push forward the economy. There are many more things I could say, but I'm going to stop there. So in other words, participation in governance could be the key to the participation of women in the workforce. And what are your expectations? This is my question. What are your expectations and the impact that you see for your project? What sort of impact will it have?
Well, we're already seeing the impact. First is that amplifying women's voices inputs into government policy making. So, government is responding to these messages that they're getting from women. Secondly, amplifying women's voices makes other women see that it's actually possible for them to participate in dialogue. Many generations of feeling like you're a second-class citizen and you don't have the right to speak in public space, and eventually seeing this possible changes the kind of structural behavior of society. And this is the essential element for women to participate in governance and even aspire to higher office. Our work essentially is also focused on ensuring that the women that we pick are young women. So we can expect, our expectation is that in the coming 5 years or 10 years, we're going to have generations of women who are coming up, who are part of this new culture of participation in influencing policy at government level and even community level. We are already seeing young women who are 18 years old or 17 years old knocking on the door of the local councillor and asking the councillor what he's done about local issues. We also are seeing that local institutions are taking an interest in these women who are speaking up, and they are getting jobs. They are also using platforms to connect with other people and sell their commodities, essentially amplifying markets and possibility to interact with people outside of their traditional environment. So we can only project for now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Alors, en conclusion, rapidement, donc comme vient de le dire tout à l'heure Riadh, la pleine participation.
Full participation of women in the workforce is an all-important factor and guarantees the sustainable development of a country. And to this regard, Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum wrote, in fact, recently,
are two of the core drivers of sustainable long-term economic growth. If half of these talents are underdeveloped or underutilized, the economy will never grow as it could. Et étant donné que la société de l'information est en train...
Also, the information society is changing the landscape throughout the world with the abilities which are given, and this becomes an important driver, and it's essential that this acquisition of these capacities, these abilities must also especially concern women. And in fact, because of the structural imbalances of our region, especially the MENA region, the imbalances between the genders in women and young girls very often are excluded from this IT skill. And unfortunately, I was able to show this with the project that I developed in the Tunisian University. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. If you have questions, however, we'll be very willing to answer them over lunch. Thank you.